Welcome back. Our next question is from Shul Ahmed, an international listener of the podcast from Massachusetts in the US, actually a Harvard student.
Hi, George. Hi, Ed. Ed, it was great speaking with you recently during office hours here at Harvard University. My name is Shuel. I'm a Harvard graduate student with a background in healthcare, policy, and entrepreneurship. Now, my question to you both is, how can political leaders today communicate bold economic ideas without losing public trust and interest, especially in a polarized, soundbite-driven world that we are in today? And also, while sharing this question, Ed has given me the gracious opportunity to talk about my own YouTube channel that I recently launched while studying at Harvard, where we share leadership and public impact insights from some of the amazing professors and fellows here. So I'd love to share your answer with my audience as well. So thank you both, and love the podcast. Keep doing what you're doing, and looking forward to hearing an interesting answer from you both.
Oh, sure. It's a good question. Hope you enjoyed your conversations there in Harvard with Professor Balls. I guess I'm going to take issue with you about one thing, which is, yes, we do live in a kind of polarized, soundbite-driven world, as you say, but I'm not sure that is completely novel. I think politics has often had periods of real division, and successful political leaders have often used devices like kind of pithy phrases or kind of extravagant sort of personal gestures to communicate. Think of like Winston Churchill's V sign and his cigar. Think of the kind of Tony Blair era with the sound bites then. Think of Benjamin Disraeli with his kind of elaborate clothing and, his sort of famous phrases in the House of Commons at the time. In other words, I think successful leaders have always been able to exude a form of personal charisma and communication, which is quite pithy, even in a partisan environment. So I don't think it's kind of radically different. What is different is the means of communication, and certainly, a form of communicating which relies on, a press conference with a question from the BBC, which is then reported on the BBC News, is not going to reach anything like the audience it once did. And I think you do have to develop a successful social media strategy that goes with the grain of social media, doesn't look too forced, is authentic. I mean, Donald Trump, we've been talking about him earlier on these questions, has no problem communicating big ideas in a very partisan environment because he does it in such a kind of showy way. And I'm not saying I like it or applaud it, but it can certainly be pretty effective. And if you want to counter it, I think you have to, or if you want to yourself get heard, you've just got to think of clever ways to communicate the message in a way that people are going to see, that yes is kind of accessible in in a TikTok format. But in the end, maybe I'm a bit of an old romantic. I do think kind of good communication follows good policy. That fundamentally, if your policy is working, people will see the benefits of it over time. Of course, you shouldn't just leave that entirely to chance. You should be, have a good communication strategy around it. But that would be the way around. I would get the policy and then work out how to communicate it, not have a good communication, then wonder what the policy should be.
So I agree with you. And I think the issue is the policy and the message, and that's more important than the means. I was hearing Gordon Brown a week or so ago talking about the global financial crisis. I think it was reported in the papers with him saying, if only he'd had social media and Twitter at the time, how great that would have been for getting his message over about dealing with the financial crisis. I immediately had this image of Gordon sitting at his computer, typing out tweets and pressing send. And I'm not totally sure whether that necessarily would have worked well. But the key thing is the message right? And you can have experts at getting the message out in the most modern way. But if you've got a bad message and a bad policy, the means doesn't solve your problem. And, arguably, I think Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling did a brilliant job in policy terms through the financial crisis, but they didn't do great at the messaging, I would say, during that period. It was too technical. The public weren't always understanding what they were doing. Whereas if you think back to, I'll give you some credit, long-term economic plan. If you think back to our early period in the Treasury, of two phrases, prudence for a purpose or welfare to work, they were phrases which had a lot of content. They told you about values. They told you about what you were trying to achieve. it meant that lots of the individual policies could be hung under that messaging framework. I actually think Donald Trump is partly struggling at the moment because I'm not sure the public in America know what his message is about foreign policy or tariffs. What is his tariffs message? He says tariffs. I'm going to have more tariffs. I love tariffs. At the moment, all these businesses are saying, yeah, but they're going to put up prices and undermine our business. I'm not sure whether at the moment he's doing as well as he should be on his messaging, and that's being reflected in the polls. So I think, Shul, that you can use means, but in the end, the content of the message, the thing which kind of links Winston Churchill or Harold Wilson or Margaret Thatcher at best or Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, you when you are succeeding, is the message and the policy which underpins that. And I think you're right. That is unchanging. And if I said to you in the last year, what's a single phrase of message which captures what the government is doing on economic policy?
No, you can't think it, and you can't think of what that is. But that's partly because
that is a.
But isn't there also a kind of question of no one doubted when Winston Churchill said, we're going to fight them on the beaches, we're never going to surrender, that he himself probably would be fighting on the beaches, even if a load of other people would be thinking, well, maybe now would be a time to surrender. In other words, it was a kind of authentic him. And Margaret Thatcher, in the middle of her "U-turn if you want to, ladies not for turning," no one doubted she was going to dig in, even if maybe the Tory party was going to get cold feet. In other words, there's a kind of authentic belief in the reform, in the big change that this leader is making, and they've put they're betting the farm on it. They're betting their career and their future on this idea. And I don't think you can. You feel that the Starmer government, but this would be true, by the way, of the Sunak government before it and so on. So it's not. I'm not really making a partisan point. That there's some sort of fundamental change to the country that they were put on earth to deliver. There's almost that sort of messianic quality to kind of really strong leadership, which is a bit mad. It's a bit, but human beings will follow it until they suddenly think it's the wrong thing to follow and he's taking us off a cliff. But and I that's when the kind of more managerial, the more technocratic form of leadership is much harder to inspire a lot of love for, even if people in the end kind of respect it and admire it.
I agree, but I just think it has to have, in the end, it has to have content. I've now remembered, I think the government's phrase is plan for change, but it doesn't have any content. It doesn't tell you anything about values or purpose or...
And it doesn't ring a bell when you mention it to me. And
there we are. Thank you, Sean. That's really interesting. We hope your YouTube listeners and viewers will not only enjoy our answer to your question, but also maybe join us on our podcast in future. We'd like that very much.